One last thing occurs during John Quincy Adams' presidency that is important to know because it comes back up again during Andrew Jackson's presidency. The U.S. Congress will pass a tariff in 1828 that raised levels to really high, which infuriated the South, especially South Carolina. Just to repeat, tariffs are good for business in the North, but it is bad for the South because it makes prices higher. And so Southerners never liked it. South Carolina in particular will be especially angry about it and call it the Tariff of Abominations, and they will actually start calling for secession and to leave the Union. If you're wondering why South Carolina, leading up to the Civil War, South Carolina is the epicenter of the craziest people in the South. It is the first state to secede, and also it's comparable to what Massachusetts was leading up to the American Revolution, and today what Florida is. Just kidding. Don't come at me. If you're wondering why, it's because it had the largest slave population. Places that had larger slave populations as a percentage of the population, they tended to be more aggressive in defending slavery and their rights. Like the Caribbeans, they were some of the most brutal treatment of slaves anywhere in the American hemisphere. South Carolina will be a state where more than half the population is enslaved, the highest of any state in the South. So that's why South Carolina is the epicenter of the craziest people leading up to the Civil War. Now, when South Carolina said they were going to secede, this caused a problem for the leading politician in South Carolina, John C. Calhoun. If you think he looks a little bit crazy, he looks more and more crazy as time went on. And also, it's not like just the picture made him look like that. Even in his own time, people said, like, his stare was an intensity that made people uncomfortable. If you remember, Calhoun is vice president under John Quincy Adams, but he is actively working against John Quincy Adams because he desperately wants to be president. And so even during John Quincy Adams' presidency, Calhoun has already aligned himself with Andrew Jackson. And it was already decided that Calhoun, after being vice president for Adams, is going to be vice president for Jackson when Jackson runs again in 1828. So Calhoun has a problem. He desperately wants to be president. And it is very hard to be president of the United States if your home state has seceded from the Union. So Calhoun had to do something to calm his state down. And that something was the South Carolina Exposition and Protest. He will write the South Carolina Exposition and Protest anonymously and then submit it to the South Carolina legislature, which passes it. And it is really important to know. And it says three things. First, that the protective tariff is unconstitutional. You don't have to know this, but just so you know, lawyers are supposed to be good at logic, making a logical argument. It's called the logician's argument. Not magician, logician. It's how you line up your evidence. And how could he possibly argue the protective tariff was unconstitutional? According to the U.S. Constitution, the federal government has the right to regulate interstate and foreign commerce. That is what tariffs do. They're for regulating interstate commerce. Calhoun argued that while the government can regulate commerce, the tariff was unconstitutional because it actually promotes manufacturing. If you are ever in a logical debate with someone, you never give them the first point, otherwise then the rest of their points follow logically. So his first point was dumb anyway. And the reason it's dumb is because he's acting like those two things are mutually exclusive. It is either government can either regulate commerce or it can promote manufacturing, but tariffs do both. But tariffs are 100% constitutional. So that's his first point, though. It's unconstitutional. Second, and this is the really important point, he laid out a blueprint for what states should do if the federal government does something that it deems unconstitutional. If Congress passes a tariff or anything that a state deems unconstitutional, he has the remedy. Nullification, that is ignoring a law, and then secession. And he will base his argument off of Jefferson and Madison's Virginia and Kentucky resolutions and compact theory of the Constitution. Every states' rights argument stems from Jefferson and Madison's compact theory of the Constitution. Remember, they wrote that in response to the Alien and Sedition Acts. What they didn't do, what Calhoun will do, is actually put a blueprint step by step of how states would go about nullifying a law and then seceding. And you don't have to know the exact steps, but again, this will come up again later. But here's how he laid out the steps. So Congress passes a tariff. Then the state calls a constitutional convention and they vote to nullify the tariff. So the state nullifies the tariff on the grounds that it deems it unconstitutional. The ball then goes back to Congress. Congress has to make the decision. Either they will change the tariff so the state accepts it, or they can get a constitutional amendment passed. And, they can change the Constitution to say tariffs are constitutional and get 3/4 of the vote, 3/4 of the state to agree to it. So then you cannot argue it's unconstitutional when it is a constitutional amendment. Now, if Congress does the first and changes the tariff to make the state happy, then the state wins. But if Congress passes a constitutional amendment, then the ball goes back to the state. And when it goes back to the state, that is when the state then gets to decide if it wants to be part of the United States or not. So at that point, that is when the state can decide if it wants to secede from the Union. So what Calhoun did here that is so novel is he took the compact theory of the Constitution and he actually put step by step how a state goes about nullifying a law. And if the law, nullifying and then seceding, if it deems an act of Congress unconstitutional. So that is the second point, is laying out that blueprint. The third point is, he said, don't do anything. He was talking to the people of South Carolina. He said, don't do anything. 1828 is an election year, and he said there's soon going to be someone in the White House that will be sympathetic to the South and will undo this unconstitutional tariff. And didn't say it explicitly, but everyone understood he's talking about Andrew Jackson. Also, can't remember if I mentioned this, but he wrote this anonymously. So everyone had an inkling it was him that did it, but no one knew for sure. So he wrote this totally anonymously, and the last one was told them to calm down, don't do anything. So this worked. South Carolina calmed down, and South Carolina will calm down and wait for the next election. Now, this is really important, though, because, again, he took it much farther than Andrew Jackson ever did, or took it much farther than Jefferson and Madison did. Madison didn't even like the idea of nullification, and said very accurately, if every state can interpret the Constitution the way they want to, then there is no country. You cannot have a country where all 50 states get to decide which laws they're going to follow and which ones they're not going to follow. It would mean the end of the country. So they very much oppose this, but Calhoun will set the mechanism in place, and it will come up again during Andrew Jackson's presidency.